So this is something I wrote as a gift for Peter, who helped me get to an amazing dance event that I wouldn't have been able to attend otherwise. So thank you, Peter. It's more of an exploration of a concept than an actual story, I think, but there's a certain amount of Wikipedia-based research and COD medical terminology that's used in it, so if there are any neuroscientists watching this, please just suspend disbelief. It's called touch. Evidentiary support for the study of extraordinary haptic memory and its relation to the overdevelopment of the parietal lobe. Case study C. Female, 29 years of age. Subject refused an EEG but consented to an fMRI scan and verbal interview. Interview conducted by Dr. Monroe at the Centre for Somatotopic Research. All names have been redacted. Good afternoon, Ms. Thank you for agreeing to participate in this study. I know you have previously undergone similar scans and testing in other related trials, and we deeply appreciate your patience and assistance in furthering our research. A faint smile of acknowledgement, a dip of the eyelids. The gesture would usually be accompanied by a nod or a tilt of the head, but C holds herself almost unnaturally still. She sits upright on her chair, feet side by side on the floor, leather-gloved hands curled into loose cylinders in her lap, as though holding a pair of salt shakers. Her posture does not look uncomfortable exactly. In fact, I know from reading her case notes that she has adopted it specifically so that she can sit for long periods without shifting position, but she is so utterly motionless that it is a little unnerving. I am suddenly hyper-aware of my own casual posture, legs crossed, elbow propped against my desk, and without quite meaning to, I sit up, mirroring C's erect poise. She notices, and the corners of her mouth twitch with amusement. I suppress an immediate urge to fidget. This will be a brief interview, and hopefully more informal than those you've had on previous occasions. I would like to ask you some questions and speak to you about your own personal day-to-day experience. I may ask you to perform some small exercises, but there will be no clinical testing, and there is no obligation to comply with any requests or answer any questions that make you feel uncomfortable. I will be recording this session, but the transcript will of course be kept anonymous and confidential other than for the purposes of the study. Does that all sound acceptable? That's fine. Her voice is lower than I'd expected, almost hoarse, but she speaks with no sign of shyness or hesitancy. I switch on the recorder and glance briefly over the results of her scan. Before we begin, can you tell me what you already know about your own, I search momentarily for a word other than condition, your own cerebral development? Not that much. I've been told that my parietal opercula are much larger than most people's, but none of the doctors I saw could ever really explain why that would make such a difference. That isn't surprising. Even now we are struggling to understand many things about that area of the brain. I consider for a moment, tapping my pen against the page in front of me. How much do you know about the parietal opercula? I know Einstein didn't have them. I'm surprised into a laugh. She gives that faint smile again, her eyes crinkling a little at the corners. According to some neuroscientists, yes, his lower parietal lobe was unusually well developed though. So I'm a sort of reverse Einstein. Again, I'm caught a little off guard, the twist of dry humour in her voice belying the forbidding, statue-like remoteness that her stillness imparts. I wouldn't say that. Visuospatial cognition is strongly dependent on that region of the brain. Einstein's ability to visualize problems, actually to articulate abstract concepts as images in his head. Memory and stimulus may not have interacted for him in the rather unique way they do for you, but his experience may not have been as far from yours as you might think. She looks amused and a little pleased at this, her face more at ease now, although her posture remains as erect as ever. Out of curiosity, I deliberately relax back into my chair to see if she will unconsciously mirror me the way I did her, but she doesn't move a muscle. The parietal operculum functions, amongst other things, as the secondary somatosensory cortex. That is, it's involved in the memory of physical stimuli. Things like remembering the differences between tactile shapes and textures, as well as mapping the body's surface. Neuroimaging studies have found activation in this area in response to light touch, pain, tactile attention, and so on. C is clearly following closely, and I am still professor enough to feel gratified at her attentiveness. The last trial I was in, the doctor was talking about, is it haptic memory? Precisely. Now, haptic memory is usually of extremely brief duration. 10 seconds on average is how long that region is active in the registering of immediate information. As you know, however, your parietal opercula are unusually overdeveloped. From what we can gather in the scans, probably the most highly developed of all the cases we've seen here at the centre. This means I can hear myself shifting into didactic mode, and I break off before I can begin lecturing in earnest. Well, perhaps you can explain to me in your own words exactly how this difference manifests for you. She takes her time in replying, her brows contracting a little as she sorts through her response. The clock on my desk ticks softly in the barred golden light. Other than that, the room is quite still, its silence somehow amplified by the motionless figure on its chair. When I just sit and think about things that have happened in the past, I remember them just like everybody else does. Stuff from a long time ago is vague and blurry. Recent or bigger things are more definite, and I can remember more of them. Sometimes I get a few odd bits and bobs of something, but then nothing else. Usual memory stuff, you know. I nod encouragingly. But then, with touch, her eyes narrow minutely, or not even necessarily touch. It's like if I hold my arms in a certain position or feel a sensation on my skin, I get this absolute recall of whenever in the past I've had that same sensation. She trails off a little, looking dissatisfied, and glances uncertainly at the recorder. So you are able to store and access memories in vivid detail using tactile sensation, is that correct? Yes, sort of. It's more than just vivid though, it's like an echo. Everything I saw, everything I felt in that moment, as if I'm living it all over again. My past overlaid on top of my present like two reels of film pressed together, running through one projector. Her gaze flicks abruptly back to me. And I wouldn't say it's something I'm able to do. It's not like some kind of superpower I can turn on and off. It just happens all the time, whether I want it to or not. I already know this much from reading her file, of course, but I am struck by her tone. Her low voice is bladed with a thin edge of weariness. She sounds for a moment like a much older woman. And how does it make you feel when you experience this? She wrinkles her nose, the corners of her mouth tucking back in a petulant moo. The illusion of age vanishes instantly. It can be very disorientating. I have to be very careful about what I do with my body, the physical sensations I let myself experience. I wear gloves as often as I can, long sleeves if I'm going out anywhere. That helps, takes the edge off some of it, but still, I try not to move more than I have to. In case you accidentally access memories, yeah, or store new ones. It's not a guarantee though, there are plenty I've created myself by accident. If I put my right hand low on my belly and press down, for example, she raises her eyebrows in invitation and I mimic the movement she describes. Can you guess what that one is? I cradle my abdomen, trying to imagine what would invoke this particular sensation. Nausea? Almost. Period pain. She gives a twist of her lips, which so perfectly denotes a shrug that for a moment I'm convinced her shoulders have actually moved. It seems to be one of the few instinctive gestures I'm not able to control. It's so ingrained now that if I were to do what you're doing, I'd experience the memory of cramps so vividly I would actually feel them in my body. Really? I sit up. I didn't realize your haptic memory could trigger genuine physical sensation. Her mouth twitches and I cough, aware that my eagerness, though professionally understandable, is hardly sympathetic. It sounds very distressing. C gives me an oddly unreadable look. It can be a lot, but it can be useful too. She shoots me a sudden, impish grin. I used it in school to cheat on my exams. For all my years of teaching, I am oddly delighted at this. Did you? How? Well, I don't know if you could call it cheating exactly. I used to deliberately give myself physical sensations while I was studying, hold my fingers in a particular way maybe, or touch the back of my hand in a pattern, so that when I was in the exam I could do the same thing and I'd be able to see exactly what my notes said. Can you still do it? Could you show me? A blink. Her eyes are extraordinarily expressive. She has outlined them heavily in black, and I wonder if this is a deliberate choice to make her expressions easier to read, a shorthand of physical gestures relayed entirely through her gaze, whilst the rest of her body remains motionless. She thinks for a moment, then holds up her gloved left hand with the thumb and forefinger making a circle, the other 3 fingers held stiffly out away from her. She presses the knuckle of her thumb with her right forefinger. Immediately, she begins to speak as though reading from an auto cue, the flow of words smooth and almost uninflected. During mastication, the food is mixed with saliva, which is secreted by 3 pairs of extrinsic salivary glands, namely the parotid glands located under the skin anterior to each earlobe, the submandibular glands located under the base of the tongue, and the sublingual glands located in the floor of the mouth. Saliva contains several components, including salivary amylase, an enzyme that begins the digestion of starch. Once the food has been formed into a flexible bolus, a wave of peristalsis carries it. She breaks off as I start to laugh. Ms., that is astonishing. That is astonishing. She gives a little cackle, hands returning to their resting position on her thighs and freezing once more into immobility. It doesn't really mean anything to me. It's not like I'm going around the whole time thinking about what the enzymes in saliva are. I'm just showing myself the page and reading the words off it. I did it for every subject and I passed top in everything except English. I prop my chin on my hands, fascinated. Why not in English? Turns out memorizing whole chunks of plays and poetry doesn't do shit when you've still got to work out what they actually mean. I give another undignified snort of laughter, throwing myself back in my chair. Its wooden legs creak in protest. Can you still remember it all? Everything you studied? Another subtle facial shrug. Sort of. It'll all still be in there somewhere, but I've forgotten a lot of the hand positions and stuff by now, and without them I can't access it. Sometimes I come across them by accident if my hands go a certain way while I'm doing something else, and suddenly I've got a load of geography facts scrolling through my head while I'm doing the washing up. I shake my head in astonishment, leaning forward again over the desk. For all the difficulties she faces, I can't help a momentary twinge of longing at the idea of being able to retain and access knowledge in such a way. a vast mental filing cabinet of every piece of information she's ever read, to be browsed at leisure and referenced at will. A thought occurs to me and I waggle my own hand inquiringly. Can another person do it? I mean, would it have the same effect if I were to touch your hand in that same pattern? The immediacy of her reaction is startling. C doesn't flinch, but her expression slams shut, closing up like an oyster, all that sunny irreverence swallowed by a sudden, taut wariness. Despite her perpetual stillness, I feel as though she has physically recoiled from me. I freeze, my hand still half raised. Something indefinable has shifted in C's iconic composure. I am reminded irresistibly of the poised tension of a deer the moment before flight, and the obvious implications of the comparison make me wince. I'm not certain exactly how I've erred, but I'm determined not to compound it. For a moment, we watch each other like cats. Then the air loosens a little. I have to be very careful about letting anyone touch me. They could accidentally trigger all sorts of memories. Her voice is level, impassive. I stay quite still. After a pause, she continues in a slightly more casual tone. It's either that or they create random new ones. I had to stop shaking people's hands years ago because every time I did, I got this massive rush of memories of all the people whose hands I'd shaken in the past. It made it very difficult to remember names. I think of the endless parade of Gregs and Lindas, their limp, clammy hands clasping mine at fundraisers and faculty events, and give an involuntary grimace of sympathy. A disproportionately large section of our somatosensory cortices are dedicated to processing the fine motor signals transmitted from our hands, so it makes sense that that sensation would be particularly powerful for you. It must have been overwhelming. Yeah, it was a bit. I try and avoid crowds as much as I can as well, busy shopping centres and clubs and stuff. Gigs are the worst because people are just knocking into you or grabbing you the whole time. It's just a constant memory overload, like a strobe light inside my brain. She looks a little pensive. I snuck out to see my favourite band one night when I was 16 and I passed out in the mosh pit. My best friend had to carry me outside and lie me down on a park bench. I don't really go out much anymore. Her voice is perfectly matter-of-fact, but I'm struck by a surge of pity for this lively, intelligent young woman in her bubble of untouchability, sitting as though carved from marble on her old-fashioned chair. So what do you do? The question sounds over-familiar, even rude, and I hasten to amend. You say you don't go to music concerts. What kind of activities do you find more tolerable? She doesn't reply. Again, I have the strange sensation that there's something I've missed. C's steady gaze holds no suggestion of hostility, but I feel an unaccountable awkwardness. I have to remind myself that I am not prying, that all of this information is clinically relevant. Do you enjoy... Still rattled, I grope feebly for a suggestion. Say, shopping. Even to my own ears, this sounds gauche. There is the slightest suggestion of a raised eyebrow. Not really. There's not much point for me. Pretty much all my clothes are the same kind of shape and made out of the same materials so that I don't get specific feedback from them. She cuts a sudden glance at me, gaze sharpening with mischief. Unless I know I'm going to have a really good time. Then I might put on something that feels different, so each time I wear it, I'll remember. Her intonation is unmistakable. Humiliatingly, I feel myself blush. C gives a soft gurgle of a laugh, a little mocking but not unfriendly. I'm not entirely certain how to respond, but she takes pity on me and moves the subject along herself. There are no further sticky moments, but I don't ask her to demonstrate any more memory access techniques, and she doesn't offer to show me. We cover her likes, her dislikes, her daily routine, the measures she takes to control her haptic capacity. I enjoy walking on flat, level surfaces. I don't really exercise. I rarely dance. I don't like crowds. A litany of negatives and restrictions, outlining a life of suspended animation that I am increasingly sure is not at all the life she actually leads. It's not that I think she is lying to me. Apart from anything else, all the measures she describes are perfectly congruent and sensible for someone with her extraordinary condition. But the more she tells me, the more certain I am that there is something more, some other dimension to her life, a depth that is concealed by perspective. I know that when this interview is transcribed, her existence will sound painfully lonely, but I cannot shake the idea that what she is showing me is an optical illusion, a careful composition of distance and proportion, to be revealed only if one reaches out to touch the surface. I can't be certain where this feeling is coming from. Certainly she has said nothing to suggest concealment. She continues to talk readily, answering my questions with no sign of hesitation or avoidance. And yet. I've been studying the mysteries of perception for long enough to trust my own. I don't know what it could be, but there is something here, some vast truth to this woman's life that lies just out of sight. The obvious metaphor would be that of an iceberg, but that doesn't seem right for C. Despite her frozen posture, there is nothing glacial about her. She is warm, engaging. Whatever her secret is, she carries it around inside her like a lighted candle. I have to be very careful about letting anyone touch me. I remember an illuminated manuscript that I saw once in a museum. The book lay open inside its glass case, vellum glowing with gold leaf and coloured inks, fantastical animals stalking and winding between the intricate letters, that one single sheet a masterpiece in its richness and complexity. At either side, the rest of the pages were tucked close like folded wings, hundreds of them, their magnificent contents only to be guessed at, perfectly displayed, yet maddeningly inaccessible. Eventually, the interview draws to a close. I thank C for her time, and she rises in one smooth, spare movement, her barreled hands by her sides. She is halfway to the door before I speak, the words out of my mouth before I quite know what I'm saying. Miss, may I ask? C turns back to face me, her whole body pivoting gracefully on the spot, like a ballerina in a music box. I hesitate. I'm aware that my curiosity is bordering on unprofessional, but the need to know pushes me on. Please do feel free to ignore this question if you find it intrusive, but is there anyone who is able, or that is, whom you permit? I struggle to frame the question, stumbling to a halt in embarrassment as I realise how prurient it sounds. For all the expressiveness of her black-rimmed eyes, C's face is suddenly sphinx-like. She gazes at me consideringly, then she arches one ironical eyebrow. For the first time without my invitation, her hands move. With ritual deliberation, she brings her left hand in front of her body, wrist tilted, flat palm facing upward and out in an oddly supplicatory gesture, like a Byzantine icon. With her right, she bracelets her forearm with middle finger and thumb just below the edge of her glove. Her hands are just large enough that her fingertips touch lightly over the blue veins in her upturned wrist. A hectic flush rises immediately across her cheekbones. Almost imperceptibly, the rigid control of her body sways. My eye has become so attuned to her absolute stillness that the shift is shocking. For a split second, I am convinced that she is about to fall. She takes a single, deep, shuddering breath. For a long moment, she holds my gaze. There is something in it like a challenge, but when she finally speaks, her voice is cool, almost disinterested. Yeah, there's one person. She gives me that faint, secretive smile again. Just one. Then her hands are back at her sides. Head held erect, as proud as a duchess, she turns and walks out of the room.